We're reading the book, The Secret Team by Fletcher Prouty, and we're on page 198. And, 197. Interesting. Okay, we're going to keep going. When they are repeated too frequently, when they grow too large, and when they are poorly developed and directed, they are harmful and they destroy any good that might come from them. The operation described was real, but it was not a single operation, and it did not happen exactly as described, even though it took place many years ago, and the significance of that project had been lost in some time. Some of the people involved are still in the business, and some of the places used may still be used from time to time. It serves to demonstrate how a really professional special operation can be done, as contrasted with some of the haphazard and careless missions that are often carried out by some of the irresponsible non-professionals who so easily slip under the cloak of secrecy. For example, we have said that the country involved was Norway. This was selected because the U-2 did not use Norway on certain flights over the Soviet Union. In most cases, the host country is told the truth, or at least all the truth that is known at the time of the first briefing. In a case such as the one, the station chief in Norway would tell you this counterpart that we are preparing an operation in which the plane would be sent into Russia with a team, and then we would return there 10 days later to pick them up. Since the Norwegians shared NATO secrets, it is possible that they would be promised some of the data acquired. In some cases where the flight had more than ordinary significance, the Norwegians might only be told about the air defense mission and not about the nuclear weapons tests. The host country might wish to have a representative at the scene before the departure to satisfy itself, and should the plane crash in Russia and be found there, nothing on it should give evidence that it had taken off from Norway. I'm having some stopping. They're trying to stop me. They're trying to stop me, yo. Just remember who you dealing with, yo. You remember that I'm a yoga person and I'm a bodybuilder, and you try doing those practices that I've done, and you will know that I will always win. The Norwegian government would be asked to participate in the NATO exercise that was laid on to provide cover for the use of Lorand navigation equipment and generally to soften up the Soviet attention to activity in the area. For this, the Norwegians would be permitted to build the United States for all-out pocket costs, including out-of-pocket costs. See, I don't know. Maybe you guys aren't that smart, because I can't say these words because you're not intelligent to read Colonel Prouty's words. So again, we have a language barrier between the Norwegians and the Americans, is my point. Which is why you're always so mad all the time. Because you don't vibrate the same frequency based on culture. So just listen. For this, the Norwegians would be permitted to build the United States for all out-of-pocket costs incident to such activity. In other words, the United States would pay for all part of the exercise that the Norwegians could not have paid for had they not participated in it. This can run into an appreciable amount of money in equipment. Norway might ask for and could expect to be granted assurances that at the event of the exercises was uncovered for any reason, the United States would positively ignore and, if necessary, deny any participation in it, and would guarantee that no mention be made of Norway in any event. This did not happen in the case of the Powers U-2 flight, and Norway and Pakistan were forced to make their own embarrassing public statements. It might also require that in the event the plane was detected and had to flee the area, it would fly away from Norway to an alternate landing near a U.S. ship of submarine. I'm not sure if you're still holding a grudge on that. It's time to move on. I'm reading about and exposing them, but you also need to take responsibility in your role in it. In other words, Norway or any other host country would have a lot to say about their own involvement. This, of course, varies a lot with the country and the situation. If by some chance we were helping that one country against a traditional enemy and our special operation was inadvertently discovered, the country being helped would be glad to have its enemy know that the United States was helping it. As a matter of fact, such a situation usually leads to a so-called inadvertent disclosure. So obnoxious is the first country to let the second country know that the United States is on its side, but this would not have been the case in our example. There would also be some arrangement that involved the minor participation of the West German government and the British. Each of these countries would be handled separately, if possible, to keep the primary mission from being exposed. This is not possible sometimes, and the responsible agent may have to brief his counterpart in West Germany and in England. None of these matters alone seems so important. The ST usually briefs the higher staffs of the government piecemeal, and so they rarely get to see the whole picture as it accumulates. I can say and spell accumulates. Some people can't. The opposite is true overseas. In this rather modest exercise, 3 foreign countries plus the Soviet Union were involved, and should add a fourth because certain crewmen had been kept in social isolation in Greece. In many ways, knowledge by other countries is as important a consideration as any other. From the date on which they become involved on, each of these countries will know that the United States is actively involved in clandestine operations and that it is willing to involve other countries with it in these endeavors. From that day on, it is impossible to convince any one of those countries again that the United States does not become engaged regularly into such actions. As time went on, the other countries were involved in other minor events, such as the use of seemingly clean national commercial airline to do some camera spying on other clandestine projects. The list grew until by 1971 there were very few countries anywhere in the world that had not at one time or other been somehow engaged in clandestine operations with this government. The significant thing here is that though all of these countries know this, and the Soviet Union and its community of nations know it too, the shield of secrecy spun by the ST here in the United States keeps much of this information from our own eyes, ears, and minds. Then we hear other nations speaking quite openly of the things this government does that are exactly above board. There are those who would say, those foreigners are always saying untrue and malicious things about us. In reality, they are doing nothing more than referring to things that each of them knows we have done, because each of them has at one time or other been involved with us. It's kind of like dating. It's exactly like dating. It's ridiculous. This brings up another fact of this kind of operation. In many of these countries, governments are overthrown in fast succession and quite unpredictably. What happens to the members of the inner circle of the government that was once in power and shared secrets with us, now that it has been overthrown and these men are in exile or at least powerless in their country? They do not forget all these past events. They do not only remember these events, but they capitalize on their knowledge in many ways. Some are quite sophisticated and they abide by their time until they have a chance to contact the man who used to contact them when they were in power. Now they whisper that they knew in government is communist oriented and that with a little help they can get back in power. Others are less sophisticated and more direct. They make deals where they can uncover other actions and networks in which they think is a loyal effort to help their old cause against the current government, not caring about the exposure of the United States, whether the matters to them at all or not. And there are others who use their information for open blackmail. Some collect and some disappear. The same is true for those who are voted out of office They have known the inner workings of government. When someone tries to say that things were not quite as they were, many of these men, hoping to make a political comeback, are forced to reveal things that they have known. There have been a number of cases where this information about their government participation with the United States in special operations has led to subtle legal blackmail. Each government gets foreign military aid according to a carefully worked out schedule. A number of governments have used the CIA relationships they have established to plead for and to gain by heavy-handed methods hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment that they could not have gotten otherwise. In summary, there are few, if any, men in government from the NSC on down through the executive branch or in the Congress who have had the opportunity to put enough of these events together to see how heavy and oppressive 20 or more years of accumulated clandestine operations can be. When a new Assistant Secretary of Defense or Assistant Secretary of Defense can be in public something like the United States has no combat troops in Laos and it has not had any there, and it will not have any there. At least 15 or 20 other nations can listen and recall that they have at one time or another directly participated in actions that involved American combat troops in Laos, or since this is intended as an example, in some other country. In many such cases, the person who makes such a statement is known either to be uninformed or lying. There's a good story about American Army troops in Laos about 15 years ago. An agreement had been reached whereby the U.S. government would take over certain training functions and the French would leave. Some French were to remain advisors in government and as a training cadre with the armed forces in Laos. By a local government worked out with the government of Laos and with the senior French officials there, a military aid program was established, calling for the delivery of large quantities of U.S. manufactured military weapons. However, the use of many of these weapons was dependent upon a degree of training and a sophistication beyond the ability of the Laotian army. The American ambassador volunteered that he could have rearranged for American civilian training personnel to come to Laos for the sole purpose of training the air forces of that country on American equipment. This offer was accepted, and it was broadened to include military matters with which at that time were included in the general concept of civil action. This gave these U.S. training personnel broader responsibilities to include such things as irrigation, village, hygiene, and sanitation, rudimentary school building and construction, and related tasks, all in addition to the regular weapons orientation. It also included basic electronics work and a communications indoctrination of a low order of skill. By the time these whole programs had been packaged, the requirement for instructors had grown to several 100,000. Oh, scratch that, it was several hundred. Although this entire endeavor had that appearance of being entirely overt and coming under the responsibility of the ambassador, it was an invisible staff of CIA men who had worked up the idea of counteract French influence, which was admittedly at a low ebb following the defeat in Dien Bien Phu. In these days, there was as much animosity between the CIA and the French as between the CIA and the Pays de Lao. The CIA team got to the military assistance program and proved the equipment destined for Laos. The next thing was to get the civilian instructors to accomplish this task. They beefed up their own staff with a number of new men they turned to the Army for volunteers, who would be sheep dipped and sent to Laos as civilians. The term sheep dip appears in the New York Times version of the Pentagon Papers without clarification. It is an intricate Army devised process by which a man who is in the service as a full career soldier or officer agrees to go through all the legal and official motions of resigning from the service. Then rather than acutely being released, his records are pulled from the Army personnel files and transferred to a special Army intelligence file. Substitute, but nonetheless real appearing records are then processed and the man leaves the service. He's encouraged to write to friends and give a cover reason why he got out. He goes to the bank and charge card services and changes his status to civilian and does the hundreds of other official and personal things that any man would do if he really had gotten out of the service. Meanwhile, his real Army records are kept in secret, but not forgotten. If his contemporaries get promoted, he gets promoted. All the things that can be done for his hidden records to keep him even with his peers are done. Some real problems arise in the event he gets killed or captured as a prisoner. There are problems with insurance and with benefits his wife would receive, and he remained in the service. Had he remained in the service. At this point, sheep dipping gets really complicated, and each case is handled quite separately. In this instant, the Army readied several hundred sheep-dipped officers enlisted men for duty in Laos. They were hired by a private company created by CIA, and they were called the White Star. The White Star teams. The total number of men involved was kept a secret from all parties, and the teams were infiltrated and entered in the country in the airport of Vientiane. Others came in overland by the points of entry. Some came in on clandestine cargo flights. Finally, the last group made a ceremonial entrance into Laos by commercial air, most likely on the Prime Minister's own airline, Air Laos. They were met in the airport by an official party from the American embassy and were accompanied by Laotian and French officials. This small overt party contained all the higher rankings. White Star Party. In customary order of precedence, reverse order of rank, everyone had disembarked from the plane except the senior official, who of course was known simply as a civilian. When he appeared at the door of the plane and looked out over the scene and at the welcoming party at the foot of the stairs, his eyes rested on American officials he had known before during the long days of his special training indoctrination. Upon Laotians he had heard of them by name, but whom he was to meet for the first time, and upon French officials whom he had not expected to see at the plane. He expected that the White Star teams under his leadership would replace the French of the favor of the host of Laotians for a short time. Then he saw the figure of a ranking French officer. Their eyes met for the first time in more than a decade. Of all the men, the sheep-dipped Army Colonel John A. Heinges could have met at the steps of the plane in Venetian Laos, and one whom he saw was a French officer with whom he had spent years in the German prisoner of war camp. Months of preparatory cover work went up in smoke. French intelligence there were able to match the cover story official record of this civilian with his known true role in the U.S. Army Special Forces. Once they discovered his identity, the White Star team bubble burst, even before it got started. Here again is an example that adds up along with so many others to prove that what may be called clandestine and what may be treated with deep secrecy in the never, never land of secret team, Washington, is really not so secret and so undercover out in the cold, factual world. There have been so many generals and admirals from the U.S. Army and Air Force who have either been serving on assignment with the CIA or who were really CIA career men serving on a cover military assignment or both, or mixes of both, and who have worked in Southeast Asia during the past 20 years, all as a primary duty with the CIA. That it would be no wonder at all that the officials of governments from Korea to Pakistan would certainly be excused for not knowing whom or what they were dealing with every time they came upon a senior grade military man. There's no place to name their names, but even a quick scan of Pentagon papers will fill a whole page with these names. For example, Air Marshal Kai of Vietnam may not know to this day that some of his closest early friends in the U.S. Air Force were not really with the Air Force at all. And Colonel Thu, now President Thu, could be excused if he never really knew whether most of the generals who were closest to him were really agency men or U.S. military men on agency assignments. The record is now so public that Diem's tutelage in the hands of Magsay's creator, Lansdale, that it certainly may be redundant to point out that Lansdale was serving the CIA in the Philippines and in South Vietnam. His case was quite special even in that role, because he served a special inner sanctum of the agency and not the regular agent section. Some of these greatest problems in Southeast Asia were the result of mix-ups, not with communities, not with communists, or with the French, whom he detested and who had similar feelings for him, but with other members of the agency clandestine staff who either did not know who was at first, or if they did know, would not accept him. The Little White Star Team episode was very modest with respect to its attempt at the big game of clandestine operations. 2 former commanders-in-chief Pacific Armed Forces have served with or are now serving as directors of Air America. This huge overt airline is properly listed and done in broadsheet and in many public telephone books. It is not usual to find high-ranking admirals serving on its board of directors. However, when some of these directors call on old friends in the DoD at times with Air America is bidding on the U.S. Air Force aircraft maintenance contract or in the Navy air transport carrier contract in the Pacific, they attend the meeting as Admiral this or Admiral that, but when the chips are down, someone adeptly slips the word that the CIA is asking no favors, remember, but all it does ask is fair competitive position. This admiral do their job for the CIA like any other agent. By the same token, when ranking officers travel throughout the Pacific on what appears to everyone, and of course especially to officials of the host countries, to be U.S. defense establishment business, no one should be surprised if in later years these same host countries begin to wise up and think that almost everyone they meet must be CIA. This is not a something thing, a sometime thing. It involves a large number of senior officers, up to and including those wearing 4 stars, and its certainly prime opponent stretches credulity. Credulity. It's like these words he uses. Stretches credulity. It's like credible, like being credible. Credulity. Not to expect that in this whole string of Asian nations, not one of which can be faulted on the grounds of being both clever and wily, someone would take advantage of the CIA versus the overt military establishment routine for his own ends. Chiang Kai-shek has been the prime exponent and recipient of many disadvantages of this game. Marshal Sarat of Thailand was not far behind, and Ngu Dinh Diem knew how to play both sides against each other for his own ends, and finally, even his own creators let go of the string and he fell. The example of the small flight operation into Russia knows something else that enters into peacetime special operations as carried out by the ST. The law of the NSC directives that followed did not authorize the CIA to build up forces sufficient to carry out such operations. However, when the NSC did direct an operation, there were no such limitations on the senior authority concerning money, manpower, and materials. The NSC would stipulate that the agency perform such tasks with civilian resources. It could further stipulate the CIA perform the operation with civilian mercenary non-U.S. personnel, or it would permit the agency to utilize the obvious resources in the U.S. military establishment up to the point of the actual flight. This became a customary procedure, at least in the days up to about 1955 to 1956. During this fledgling days, and precocious agency made good use of the military. As in the flight, it gave them all kinds of tasks and enumerated. Not only would the CIA enlist direct assistance with the words that NSC F5412-2 has directed this exercise and its support by the military, but it would convene meetings in the Pentagon and the Paris headquarters of the U.S. in Europe, in Army headquarters in Heidelberg, Air Force headquarters in Wiesbaden, and Navy headquarters in London, all to churn up the idea and let these headquarters vie for each other in seeing how far they could go out of their way to support this exercise, which they knew only as a code name or at best as plausible cover story in response to the magic of CIA relationships, and the services would come up with all kinds of support. Often beyond the dreams and expectations of the agency, this had a double-barreled effect. It made a given clandestine operation much larger in its overt supporting areas than originally visualized. It led also within all the services to a growing capability, often overlapping, which had the effect of creating a very large submerged infrastructure, ready, willing, and eager to become involved again and again with the glamorous CIA. Oh, you're so glamorous. How miserable could you possibly be doing this, is all I can say. It's such an art. You know, the art of war is not going to war. Just to let you know. We shall go into this in more detail later. Let me just see how many pages I have left in this chapter. We're going to finish in this video, I think. I don't know. We'll see. There are things in every really clandestine exercise that must be done in an expert manner. In the example, we saw that the agency used non-U.S. nationals for certain hardcore assignments. One man, the pilot, was in a sense fortunate. The CIA happened to find him among thousands of displaced persons. However, one of the pilots who trained him was a real stateless or multiple national person. Also, the two infiltrated instrumentation experts were non-nationals. This type of person places a real burden on the agency, and special attention is given to them and to their welfare and maintenance. It is only one thing to use a young Polish pilot for one air mission, but what does the agency do with such a man year in and year out? Such people do exist, and such people do some important and very specialized work. It may not be James Bond all the time, but it has its moments. In between these moments, there are many problems to be solved. Among them, such things as a place to live, marriage, family, schools, vacations. Saying that they exist is sufficient for the purposes of this book. What is done with them both during operation and during the dull intervals in between would take another book. Another area of activity that lies underneath much of the commonplace activity of the agency has to do with the interminable processing, evaluating, analyzing, utilization of intelligence of all kinds. It is important to query hundreds of thousands of displaced persons and to get warehouses full of information, only if that information can be used. There are times when the agency is nonplussed and its own cleverness and resources. There are countless other facets of clandestine operations. It is ridiculous for the agency and for the rest of the government to deny them, and it is equally erroneous for those who know nothing about them to speculate about their real character and meaning. It may appear to be an oversimplification to say it, but an agency career develops a thick skin, which is occupational, and this thick skin includes an extra set of eyelids which pop over the eyeball of the mind when the man discovers himself in a situation where he finds he should not be. It is said that the tens of thousands of Japanese who live on the block in a city such as Tokyo develop the ability to live in close proximity, separated one house from the other, usually by no more than a few scant inches, and by rice paper walls and windows without question. Families in a given area hear each other and all the usual household noises. Yet they all maintain that they hear nothing of what goes on in the neighbor's house. The idea is that they are supposed to hear nothing, so they hear nothing. The same mental process permits the disciplined brain to separate out sounds. This is how the CIA works. The same mental process that permits the disciplined brain to separate out sounds one from another is not unusual in many other cases. It applies in such a sense to people who spend their lives in highly classified work. They actually learn to shut out and avoid seeking out what the other person is doing. As a result, many of the real agent careerists and staff personnel who support them really do not know what other offices are doing, and they don't care to know. I might actually do another video. Let's see, 1, 2. Yeah, we'll just keep going. This blocking out process may not apply in a majority of cases, but it is true in many. In other cases, there are men who have spent their lives in an agency who have never really had any direct contact with actual missions because of the nature of their work, and because those who are involved in operations kept such information from them. Therefore, some of these old timers really do not know what is going on. They may think that they do because they have always been aware of activity of one kind or another, and they have heard the usual rumors of what has been taking place. This is often more of a handicap than a help, because if the man has not actually gotten out of the operation, he may have heard a very well laid out a cover story and thought it was real. He would have no way to know otherwise. Examples of this in other walks of life are not hard to find. When Ford changes its model lines and is introducing some really new designs or engineering features, what it wants to keep secret, it will put several teams at work designing the next model car. At certain checkpoints of development, these teams are told, fine, now go ahead with that, what you are doing go ahead with what you are doing to the next stage. Thus unknown to each other and the fairly large staffs who support them. More than one team believes its new model is the one that the company has selected. Only at the last moment, when it is too late for them to continue the bluff and too late for a competitor to gain from discovery from the new design or feature, it is unneeded team told that their model has been selected and that their work was necessary cover to conceal the real design. It is better to have some teams actually acting the cover story. This leaves the final operational go-ahead options open until the very last moment, and assures that if there are leaks, the other side will have the problem of finding out whether the operation they have discovered is real or planned deception. The situation has practiced quite widely during the Bay of Pigs operation. Some units thought they were going to be involved in the exercise, but they never were. This had an odd result right at the office of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A team of ranking officers thought that they were working on part of the Cuban operation. They were very active and thought that the things that they were doing were really happening, and that their work was being used by the CIA. It turned out that all the things they did were dummy activities, and that the agency never even intended to use them. It was a sort of agency cover and deception operation against a part of our own forces. The military were never told that they had been working on was not used, and later during the review of the Bay of Pigs operation, the senior officers of that task actually appeared before the President's Review Board and testified concerning what they had done. Their testimony was so realistic that it was taken as the real thing, and no one ever spoke of to clarify the matter. Apparently, it was the best interest of the SC to let it go as it did. It only served further to implicate the military in the Bay of Pigs, when in reality they had very little to do with any of it. This was a very strange turn of events, exposes another aspect of the strange ways of clandestine operations. When this country permits either to enter the dream world of covert operations, it creates a national Frankenstein of such proportions that major factions within the government do not know how something happened and who authorized it and why it was done. The system begins to run itself from the moment of data input. From the agent's first bit of information to the emergence of a clandestine operation, everything is constructed entirely out of the response mechanisms to the ever-claimed threat of communism. Therefore, the system must do something anti-communist. Nowhere was there anything built in to say stop. Kirkpatrick's writing so intelligently and from an inside position of real administrative experience, so the President Kennedy paid for the abandoning of the NSC at the Bay of Pigs, he allowed himself and his principal advisors to be made the captives of the proponents of the plan. The president had insisted that the deliberations on the operation be conducted within the framework of an NSC system with appropriate staff work and review. There would have been a much greater chance that he would have received a more realistic appraisal of his chances for success or failure. This could not have been set in words, and with more truth and impact again, we see the bugaboo of CIA secrecy. It precludes the employment of normal and experienced supporting staff action. In the area of covert operation, it is especially important to have someone of high authority in the position to say no when no is called for. President Kennedy did not convene the Security Council, which might have helped him. And President Johnson's greatest failing was that even though he may have from time to time convened the council, it was by that time made up of a few responsible men and several irresponsible people who were more than frequently intended to go along with the ST on everything and left the final decision up to the president, who could not and did not say no. The discussion in this chapter is intended to serve as an introduction to the world of clandestine operations. We have discussed at the same length that the first 4 duties of the CIA, as spelled out in the language of the National Security Act of 1947, it remains to look at the 5th duty that one of the agency and the ST used to establish that it was the intention of the Congress and the President to permit the agency to become involved in the area of clandestine operations as a regular function. That was the chapter 7.